Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am super thrilled to guide you through today's topic, mainly because it's one of those wild situations where the headlines barely even scratch the surface. Now, if you've been anywhere near social media lately, you've definitely seen a flood of intense imagery and viral commentary coming out of Azad Kashmir. But today, we're going to look right past that initial social media frenzy. We are going to peel back the layers and uncover the actual roots of this recent unrest, relying strictly on the facts, the timelines, and the core structural issues at play.
You've probably seen phrases exactly like this one: Kashmir is bleeding. This kind of viral sentiment has just completely dominated the public narrative, pulling in influencers and grabbing attention worldwide. But here's the thing: when a topic gets this emotionally charged, the underlying reality almost always gets buried under the chaos. So our goal today is to cut through that surface-level noise to understand the absolute truth of what's happening on the ground. And we're going to do it without any political bias whatsoever. We aren't here to pick sides, we are simply here to understand the mechanics of this crisis.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is exactly how we'll untangle this situation piece by piece. First, the spark, the economic protests. Second, the core issue of the 12 seats. Third, the two sides of the dispute. Fourth, the escalation and hijacked agendas. And finally, the systemic failures. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. The spark. The economic protests.
So it's incredibly crucial to understand that this unrest absolutely did not start with constitutional debates. Not at all. It started with a localized leadership void around everyday economics. Let's just walk through this timeline together. Back in 2023, the region was hit by some really severe inflation, and with mainstream politicians basically failing to step up, a massive void was created. Out of that void, the Joint Awami Action Committee, or the JAC, formed in September 2023. Now, they weren't some registered political party. They were just a group of regular people coming together purely out of economic hardship. By early 2024, when they felt their voices still weren't being heard, they organized a march toward Muzaffarabad. That pressure actually worked, eventually forcing the government to the negotiating table in May 2024 to discuss a pretty extensive list of 38 demands.
And what exactly were those initial demands? Well, they were incredibly relatable. The JAC was asking for cheaper electricity, more affordable flour, and just the basic rights anyone needs for a normal, survivable life. What is really essential to note here is that during those May 2024 negotiations, the government actually agreed. They acknowledged these economic grievances as entirely justified, and they largely accepted almost all of these everyday demands. But, as we're about to see, fixing the economic issues just wasn't enough to stop the unrest.
Which brings us to part 2, the core issue, the 12 seats. Now, what's really interesting here is this is the exact moment where peaceful economic negotiations hit a total brick wall. We are literally moving from the price of flour to the highly complex architecture of regional politics. To really grasp this, let's break down the 53 seats in the Azad Kashmir Legislative Assembly. You have 33 seats filled by direct local elections, 5 reserved for women, and 1 each for ulama, overseas citizens, and technocrats. But the absolutely crucial piece of the puzzle? That's the 12 seats reserved for migrants. These are individuals who originally migrated from Indian-occupied Kashmir and now live in various other parts of Pakistan. The entire current dispute hinges entirely on the existence of these 12 specific seats.
So here is the real kicker. While the government gladly accepted the vast majority of the JAC's 38 demands, including the cheaper flour and electricity, the fate of these 12 constitutional seats became the ultimate battlefield. The negotiations totally broke down, not over economics, but over who actually has the right to be represented in the local assembly.
Moving on to part 3, the two sides of the dispute.
This is a truly fascinating constitutional clash. To understand it fairly, we need to look at both perspectives totally neutrally. On one hand, you have the JAC, who argues that these 12 seats should just be abolished outright. Their logic is very localized and, honestly, straightforward. They believe that only the people currently living in Kashmir should have a say in its politics, not migrants who live in other parts of Pakistan. On the flip side, the state vehemently disagrees. Their view is much more about long-term strategy. The state argues that these migrants made a point to stay legally linked to the region, and they absolutely require representation for a much, much larger geopolitical reason.
And that massive geopolitical reason? It all comes down to a potential UN plebiscite. Basically, the state's rationale is that if a United Nations vote on the status of Kashmir ever actually happens, the state is going to desperately need the votes of all those migrants, as well as regions like Gilgit-Baltistan, to support their cause. So abolishing these 12 seats today might seem like a quick local political win for the JAAC, but from the state's perspective, it could literally destroy the long-term Kashmir cause by legally alienating those crucial migrant voters in any future international decision.
Part 4. Escalation and Hijacked Agendas.
Unfortunately, this constitutional disagreement didn't just stay quietly in the negotiating room, and this brilliantly illustrates the really dangerous progression of this movement. Step 1. It all started with simple, understandable requests for cheaper flour and electricity. Step 2. It morphed into a very stubborn constitutional dispute over those 12 assembly seats. And Step 3, well, because the doors to negotiation basically slammed shut, the protests escalated wildly. Suddenly, we saw the introduction of highly volatile anti-state rhetoric and, terrifyingly, armed confrontation right on the streets.
According to our source material, the protest was essentially hijacked at this exact stage. The messaging totally shifted from a desperate plea for basic rights to explicit anti-state rhetoric. Slogans like Pakistan Murdabad actually began to echo through the crowds, alongside radical calls to open the borders and even pro-India speeches. The source points out that when protests cross that red line into what the state views as treasonous territory, the state security apparatus is basically forced to respond, which ends up completely overshadowing the original, entirely legitimate economic cries of the average person.
The key takeaway from the source's analysis on this point is actually super profound. Constitutional changes, like abolishing 12 parliamentary seats, can only happen through legal amendments inside the assembly. You just can't do it on the streets. By taking a deeply complex constitutional demand out onto the pavement, the movement adopted a strategy that was never going to work. And worse, it made the protests incredibly vulnerable to being hijacked by hostile external agendas that literally couldn't care less about the economic well-being of the locals. Finally, Part 5, Systemic Failures and Fallout.
So, we've seen how the protests escalated, but how on earth did the authorities let it get to this point? Well, our source maps out a massive, two-pronged institutional failure. First up, the intelligence agencies. The source highlights a huge blind spot here. How did the authorities completely fail to predict the introduction of weapons or that drastic shift toward anti-state speeches? It's framed as a really severe intelligence failure. Second, the political parties. Instead of acting as mature statesmen and mediating the crisis to keep the community united, mainstream politicians pretty much just checked out. They remained completely apathetic, focusing purely on their own narrow election politics while the situation boiled over.
Because of those combined failures, the situation has now hit a highly dangerous impasse, a total dead end. On one side, you have stubborn institutions and a state apparatus gearing up for a crackdown against anti-state elements. On the exact opposite side, you have a protest leadership that somehow allowed its platform to be compromised by radical rhetoric, and caught right smack in the middle, completely crushed by both sides, is the average Kashmiri citizen, the person who honestly just wanted affordable flour and electricity in the first place.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought drawn straight from the source analysis. The general public might absolutely harbor deep, genuine sympathies for the economic plight of their fellow citizens. But the critical question we have to ask now is this: does the protest leadership actually still stand with the state? Are their motives still aligned with the betterment of their people, or have their true loyalties somehow shifted? It's a remarkably complex, multi-layered issue, and it's one that challenges us to always look past those viral headlines to find the real story. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. And remember to always keep seeking the full picture. See you next time.